a former Navy SEAL, came home to Maine only to sell the hardware store his father had left behind. But beneath the old counter, he found a German shepherd puppy sleeping inside his father's work coat. The puppy stole screws, blocked the door whenever the veteran tried to leave, and slowly brought the silent store back to life. Then, one stormy afternoon, the dog led him to an elderly carpenter trapped beneath a collapsed workbench. The rescue uncovered an unfinished message, a hidden family promise, and the truth about why his father had kept the store waiting. What began with grief became a second chance for a broken veteran, a loyal puppy, and an entire town that had forgotten how to help one another. Tell us where you're watching from. Share your thoughts after the story. And please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. Barrett Wren returned to Briar Harbor on a bright afternoon that seemed almost offensively beautiful. The last of the winter snow had retreated into the shaded edges of stone walls and beneath the dark bellies of parked trucks. Young maple leaves trembled in the salt wind. Sunlight rested warmly on the old brick storefronts along Harbor Road, and somewhere near the waterfront, a circular saw bit through fresh lumber with a clean, familiar whine. Everything looked alive. That was what Barrett disliked most about it. His father had been buried less than 3 hours earlier, yet the bakery bell still chimed across the street. Gulls still argued over scraps near the harbor. Men in work jackets still paused outside the post office to discuss boat engines and rising grocery prices. Briar Harbor had not dimmed itself for Amos Wren, and Barrett knew it had no reason to. Still, some wounded part of him resented the town for continuing. At 38, Barrett carried himself with the controlled economy of a man who had spent years being trained never to waste movement. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, lean and powerfully built through the shoulders without the oversized bulk of a bodybuilder. His fair skin had been weathered by sea air, desert heat, and too many northern winters spent outdoors. A square jaw and pronounced cheekbones gave his face a hard, deliberate shape. His dark brown hair was cut short in the military style he had never quite abandoned, and his gray-blue eyes had the guarded stillness of someone accustomed to measuring exits before entering a room. He had once been a Navy SEAL. Now he trained private security teams, advised maritime rescue crews, and changed cities before any place could begin expecting him to stay. Barrett parked Amos's old truck beside the curb and looked up at the faded sign over the storefront, Wren and Son Hardware. The white paint had yellowed. The blue border was peeling at the corners. The word Son remained stubbornly visible, though the son named there had been gone for nearly 20 years. Barrett pulled the key from his pocket. Margaret Sloan, the 67-year-old attorney handling Amos's estate, had given it to him after the funeral. Margaret was a spare, silver-haired woman with sharp brown eyes and the habit of speaking about grief as though it were another piece of paperwork nobody could avoid forever. She had told Barrett the estate was manageable, but not simple. "Your father left you time," she had said. Barrett had almost laughed. Amos had left him a building, unpaid invoices, an old truck, and a silence long enough to qualify as inheritance. Time had not been among the assets. The lock resisted before turning. The bell above the door gave a thin, tired ring as Barrett stepped inside. The air smelled of cedar shavings, machine oil, old paper, canvas, and the faint mineral scent of metal tools. Dust drifted through shafts of sunlight. Rows of shelves stretched toward the rear of the store, crowded with screws, hinges, paintbrushes, weather stripping, plumbing fittings, hand tools, and objects Barrett could still identify without reading their labels. His body remembered the place before his heart agreed to. Behind the counter sat a ceramic coffee mug with a brown crescent dried at the bottom. A pencil sharpened with a knife rested beside an unfinished receipt roll. Amos's faded brown work coat hung from a peg near the register. Several paper bags stood beneath the counter, each labeled in his father's blocky handwriting, with names Barrett recognized from childhood, orders that would never be collected from the man who packed them. Barrett set his duffel bag down. He did not touch the coat. Instead, he called Nolan Prentice. Nolan answered on the second ring. At 46, he was a polished, patient representative of Northline Retail Group, with neatly combed ash-brown hair, a clean-shaven face, and a voice trained to make pressure sound like opportunity. He had attended the funeral in a charcoal coat and stood far enough from the family section to appear respectful, yet close enough to remind Barrett that business was waiting. "I'm at the property," Barrett said. "I hope you found everything secure. It's standing. In real estate, that is often the first qualification." Barrett glanced at the stained ceiling tiles near the rear wall. "What is the deadline? The enhanced offer remains open for 14 days. You have more time to settle the estate, of course, but Northline's current budget window does not. You want it empty, inventoried, and available for inspection." Barrett looked around the store. "That won't be a problem." There was a slight pause on Nolan's end. "Your father said something similar the first time we spoke." Barrett's jaw tightened. "My father isn't handling the sale." "No," Nolan said gently. "He is not." After the call ended, Barrett found 3 large cardboard signs in the stockroom and wrote on them with a thick black marker, "Sell, Disca, Review." He stared at the third sign, crossed out Review, and replaced it with "Not worth thinking about." That category filled fastest. He worked until the sunlight shifted from gold to pale gray. Boxes of obsolete fittings went into the sell pile. Damaged packaging went into discard. Personal objects landed in the third group before Barrett could study them long enough to feel anything. A small wooden hammer appeared in the back of a drawer. Amos had carved it when Barrett was 6, shaping the handle for a child's hand and burning the letter B into one side. Barrett held it for 3 seconds, then placed it in the box, marked "Not worth thinking about." On a support post near the storeroom, pencil lines recorded his childhood height. Barrett, AG 8. Barrett, AG 9. Beside the final line, Amos had written, "Tall enough to sell nails, not tall enough to count change." Barrett ran his thumb over the faded words. A memory rose without permission. Amos standing behind him at the register, his mother laughing near the front window. Barrett holding a paper bag of nails with both hands because he had been afraid of dropping them in front of a customer. He stepped away so quickly his hip struck a shelf. A framed photograph slid from behind an old price board and landed face up on the floor. 9-year-old Barrett stood behind the counter in a denim shirt, missing one front tooth and grinning as though the store belonged to him. Amos stood behind him, broad hand resting on the boy's shoulder. His father was not smiling at the camera. He was smiling at Barrett. Barrett turned the photograph over. By evening, the store had grown colder. He found a folding cot in the stockroom and set it beneath a narrow window. He could have stayed in Amos's house on Cedar Lane, but the thought of entering the kitchen where his father had eaten alone, sleeping in the room where his mother's clothes had once hung, and hearing the house settle around 2 decades of absence felt harder than sleeping beside bags of cement mix. He ate a sandwich standing over the counter. At 10, he turned off the lights. At 11, he was still awake. Near midnight, something metallic rolled across the floor. Ting! Barrett opened his eyes. Silence returned. He sat up slowly. A second sound followed, softer this time. a faint scrape beneath the shelving. Then a tiny, irregular breath. Barrett slipped on his boots and took the flashlight from his duffel. His old instincts returned before thought did. He moved through the stockroom without turning on the overhead light, listening between each step. The beam found a silver screw near the doorway. Another lay 3 feet farther on. Then another. They formed a crooked trail through the center aisle toward the front counter. Barrett crouched beside the final screw. The brown work coat was no longer hanging from its peg. It had been pulled beneath the counter. Something moved inside it. Barrett aimed the flashlight lower. A German shepherd puppy lay curled in the heavy folds of Amos' coat. The puppy was no more than 11 weeks old, with a soft black and tan coat, oversized paws, and a round belly that suggested recent, regular meals. One ear stood upright while the other folded slightly to the side, giving the small animal an expression of permanent skepticism. The puppy lifted his head. A screw dropped from his mouth and tapped the floor. Barrett stared at him. No, the puppy yawned. It was a complete, shameless yawn, followed by a stretch that pushed 2 large paws against the sleeve of Amos's coat. Barrett swept the flashlight across the floor. There was no food bowl, no water, no blanket except the coat. The puppy did not look starved or weak. His eyes were dark, alert, and cautious rather than frightened. "Where did you come from?" The puppy tilted his head toward the standing ear. Barrett checked every window, the front lock, and the storeroom. At the rear delivery entrance, he found the door resting against the frame without fully catching. Mud outside held several fresh paw prints leading inward from the alley. The dog had entered recently. He had not been living alone inside the store. Barrett stood under the yellow security light with the puppy tucked awkwardly against his chest. The animal smelled faintly of sawdust, cold air, and the old canvas coat. That combination troubled Barrett more than it should have. Someone had cared for this dog. Someone connected to Amos, perhaps. But why had the puppy come here on the very night Barrett returned? The thought felt too deliberate, too close to superstition. Barrett rejected it immediately. Dogs followed smells, doors failed to latch. Coincidences became meaningful only when lonely people needed them to. He carried the puppy back inside. The puppy curled into Amos's coat again before Barrett could find a box. Barrett lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. Sometime before sleep, he heard the puppy move across the floor. A moment later, a small, warm body settled against the side of the cot. Barrett did not reach down. He also did not move the dog away. By 8 the next morning, Laurel Dane stood in the doorway holding 2 coffees and a paper bag of warm biscuits. Laurel was 42, slightly above average height, with a straight-backed, capable build, shaped by long mornings, lifting flour sacks and working ovens. Her skin was fair with a warm dusting of freckles across her nose. Thick chestnut hair was twisted into a loose knot, and several strands had escaped around a face that was open, intelligent, and far too observant for Barrett's comfort. Her hazel eyes had always made him feel that she heard the sentence he had decided not to say. She looked at the puppy, chewing the end of a cardboard price tag. "You have been home less than a day," she said, "already attracting dependents. He broke in. He weighs 15 pounds. Criminals start somewhere." Laurel set the coffee down. The puppy approached her, sniffed 1 boot, then returned to Barrett and sat on his left foot. "That seems inconvenient," Laurel said. "It's temporary, of course." Barrett took the puppy to the veterinary clinic 2 streets inland. Dr. Helen Parrish, a 58-year-old veterinarian with short white blonde hair, rosy skin, and practical blue eyes, examined him. She was broad through the shoulders, gentle with animals, and blunt with humans. "He's healthy," she said. "About 11 weeks. Well-fed. Clean ears. Good coat. Someone cared for him. No microchip, no. Any sign he was lost long? Not unless he spent his difficult journey stopping for meals." She pointed to a faint flattened line in the fur around his neck. "He wore a collar recently. No missing dog report. Not in town." Barrett arranged for a regional rescue volunteer to collect him later that morning. When the volunteer arrived and opened the rear door of her van, the puppy backed away. She bent to secure the leash. The puppy twisted free. He darted across the sidewalk, slipped past Barrett's boot, crossed the quiet street, and ran through the open door of Wren & Son Hardware. By the time Barrett caught up, the puppy had disappeared beneath the counter and buried himself in Amos's coat. Laurel watched from outside her bakery. "He seems to know where he is going," she said. "Dogs do not understand real estate." Laurel looked at the faded sign above him. "Maybe he understands coming home." Barrett reached under the counter and pulled out the coat. A folded scrap of paper fell from the inside pocket. The writing was unmistakably Amos's. "Give him 1 week. Don't send him away on the first day." The upper edge of the note had been torn away, taking the name of the intended reader with it. Barrett read it twice. The puppy placed one paw on his wrist. For one uneasy second, the store seemed to become perfectly still. Sunlight warmed the worn boards. The bakery bell chimed across the street. Somewhere in the walls, old pipes settled with a low knock. Barrett had spent years dismissing signs, omens, and the small coincidences grieving people called messages. Yet the note existed, the puppy existed, and Amos, who had failed to ask his son to stay even once, had apparently asked someone to keep this little animal from being sent away. 1 week, Barrett said. The puppy licked his thumb. That was not permission. Later, while Barrett cleared a space for a temporary bed, the puppy began scratching at the wooden panel behind the counter. Barrett redirected him twice. The third time, the puppy returned and pressed his nose against the same seam. Barrett examined the board. One corner had newer screws than the surrounding wood. He removed them. Behind the panel sat a narrow iron box, dusty but carefully protected from moisture. The lid bore a name scratched into the dark metal. Barrett Wren. The box was locked. Barrett searched the drawer, the shelves, the register, and every hook beneath the counter. There was no key. When he lifted the box, he noticed shallow lettering engraved across the bottom. He turned it toward the window. "Open only when you are no longer in a hurry to leave." Barrett stood motionless. Around him, half-filled boxes waited to be carried out. The Northline contract sat beside the register. His packed duffel rested in the stockroom, ready for the road. The puppy lowered himself onto Amos's coat and watched him with one ear standing and the other folded, as if waiting to see which man Barrett intended to become. He had returned to Briar Harbor for one reason: to leave properly. But from beneath his father's counter, the dead man had placed a question in his hands, and Barrett had no idea where the key was. Barrett told himself the arrangement would last 7 days. 7 days was measurable. 7 days could be written on a calendar, crossed off one square at a time, and survived without sentiment. 7 days did not mean adoption, attachment, or a change of plans. It meant temporary responsibility, nothing more. The puppy disagreed almost immediately. Barrett named him Rivet on the second morning, after finding him asleep inside a shallow carton of metal fasteners. Rivet had somehow emptied half the box onto the floor, curled his black and tan body into the remaining space, and fallen asleep with one oversized paw resting over the label. The name fit too well. It sounded small, stubborn, metallic, and difficult to remove once properly set. Rivet accepted it by chewing the corner of the box. Barrett opened Wren & Son Hardware only because Amos had left several completed orders waiting beneath the counter. He called the customers listed on the paper bags and told them they could collect their purchases before the store closed permanently. He emphasized the final word, permanently. By 9 in the morning, Rivet had hidden 6 screws beneath the front mat, dragged a measuring tape across the plumbing aisle, and climbed into a leather glove bin, where he lay on his back with all 4 paws in the air. Barrett found him there while searching for the missing tape. "You are not helping." Rivet opened one dark eye. Barrett lifted him out and set him on the floor. Rivet immediately seized the loose end of the measuring tape and ran. The bright yellow strip extended behind him like a ridiculous tail. It caught Barrett across the ankle as he stepped around a display of paint cans. His balance shifted. One shoulder struck the shelf, and the uppermost stack of gallon cans wobbled dangerously. Barrett caught the display with both hands before it fell. Behind him, Rivet sat down. One ear stood upright, the other folded sideways. His expression suggested that gravity, poor shelving, and human clumsiness were unfortunate matters outside his control. A laugh came from the doorway. Laurel Dane stood there with a tray of coffee balanced against one hip. She wore a pale blue shirt beneath a cream-colored bakery apron, and flour dusted one sleeve near the elbow. Her chestnut hair had been twisted up carelessly, leaving loose strands against her freckled cheeks. There was no cruelty in her laugh, only surprise and a warmth Barrett had not heard inside the store since before the funeral. He straightened the paint cans. "I had it." Clearly, he dragged the tape. Laurel looked down at Rivet. "Did he?" Rivet placed one paw on the tape and looked innocent. Laurel's smile widened. Barrett had forgotten that the store could hold laughter. The sound moved strangely through the old aisles, touching the pegboards, the dusty windows, and the wooden counter where Amos had once complained that people came in for nails and stayed to discuss weather until retirement. For one uncomfortable second, Barrett felt the room respond, not like a haunted place, not like anything supernatural, more like a house settling after someone finally opened a door. He turned away first. Laurel left the coffee near the register. "Walt says the puppy stole his hat yesterday. Walt left it on the floor. He says that is not how he remembers it. Walt remembers 3 versions of everything. That was true. Walter Drummond arrived before noon to defend himself. Walt was 69, short and square through the middle, with a weather-reddened face, a trimmed white mustache, and a fringe of silver hair beneath a brown wool cap. He had worked for the Briar Harbor Post Office for 37 years, which had given him an excellent memory for names, addresses, and other people's business. Retirement had not reduced his interest in information. It had only removed the uniform that once made his curiosity look official. "I was told there was a criminal animal operating here," Walt announced. Rivet trotted. Walt pointed a stern finger. "Do not charm me." Rivet sat on Walt's boot and looked up. Walt lasted 4 seconds. "Well," he said, bending to scratch behind the puppy's good ear, "a man should hear both sides before passing judgment." He bought a small box of picture hooks he did not need. Later that morning, Evie Mercer entered slowly, leaning on a wooden cane polished smooth by use. Evie was 72, with a narrow frame, pale skin, and soft white hair cut just below her ears. She wore a green cardigan buttoned carefully over a flowered blouse, and her eyes were a clear blue that carried both humor and the fatigue of someone who had spent too many years proving she could still manage alone. She asked for 2 screws for a loose handrail. Barrett found the correct size and placed the packet on the counter. Evie studied Rivet, who had fallen asleep beneath a display of work gloves. Amos would have liked that, she said. Barrett looked up. The dog, the noise. What noise? Things moving around. Evie paid in coins, counting them twice. Barrett noticed her hand trembling slightly and asked whether the rail was safe. It is still attached. That was not the question. She gave him a look. You sound like your father when you do that. Barrett regretted asking. Evie tucked the screws into her purse. Before leaving, she touched the edge of the counter with 2 fingers, almost as if greeting someone who was no longer there. By the 3rd day, news of Rivet had traveled through the bakery, the post office, the harbor cafe, and half the houses on Alder Street. The customers did not arrive in crowds. Briar Harbor was too old and too cautious for sudden enthusiasm. They came 1 or 2 at a time, pretending to need things. 2 fishermen entered to debate whether Rivet's folded ear would eventually stand. One claimed 6 weeks. The other said never. Neither bought anything until Barrett asked whether they planned to conduct the argument all afternoon. They left with a coil of rope and a pack of waterproof matches. A boy of about 9 arrived with his grandmother and brought Rivet a faded tennis ball. The boy was thin, solemn, and missing 1 front tooth. Barrett watched him roll the ball across the floor. Rivet chased it into the paint aisle, returned proudly, then dropped it at Barrett's boot instead of the boy's. The child laughed. For a moment, Barrett saw the photograph from behind the old price board. A 9-year-old boy behind the counter, a missing tooth. A man standing behind him who did not know how little time he had. Barrett stepped away from the ball. Rivet followed. The puppy had begun to recognize Barrett's routines. He waited beside the storeroom when Barrett made coffee. He slept beneath the counter while invoices were sorted. Whenever Barrett reached for the front door key before 5, Rivet seized one of his bootlaces and leaned backward with all the determination his small body could produce. Barrett told himself the behavior meant nothing. Dogs learned patterns quickly. Lonely men assigned, meaning even faster. Nolan Prentice arrived on Thursday afternoon with a leather portfolio beneath one arm. In daylight, Nolan looked even more controlled than he had at the funeral. He was tall but not broad, with ash-brown hair combed precisely away from his forehead, a clean-shaven face, and a charcoal overcoat too refined for the sawdust near the entrance. His pale gray eyes moved over the store with professional calm, measuring walls, ceiling height, window width, and every other feature that could be converted into cost. "I see operations have resumed," he said. "They haven't." Nolan glanced toward Walt, who was comparing different sizes of wall anchors while pretending not to listen. "The door is open. I'm finishing my father's orders." Of course. Rivet approached Nolan, sniffed one polished shoe, then returned to Barrett without wagging his tail. Nolan watched him go. "So this is the famous interruption. Temporary. Everything is, eventually." Nolan walked outside and looked up at the faded sign. The survey team could begin with the front elevation next week. It would help if the sign came down first. Barrett followed him to the sidewalk. "The contract isn't signed." "No, but removing it would save time." Rivet stepped between them and gave one short bark. Nolan looked down. "It seems the board of directors objects. He has no vote." Nolan lifted his gaze to the words, "Wren and Son." "You may not either." The remark was delivered lightly, but it landed with precision. Barrett's shoulders stiffened. Nolan continued before the silence sharpened. "I'm not insulting you. Your father refused several reasonable offers. He believed sentiment could be maintained like inventory. It cannot. He is dead." "Yes," Nolan said, "and debts are not." After Nolan left, Barrett returned to the office behind the stockroom. He opened Amos's ledgers and began working through the numbers properly. The first problem was a business line of credit Amos had used to keep inventory moving during 2 slow winters. The second was a roof repair and electrical upgrade completed the previous autumn. The third was a long list of unpaid customer accounts. Some were small, $12, $23, $48. Others had grown across years. What disturbed Barrett was not the debt itself. It was the notation beside many names. Payee the bank deposits did not match. No checks appeared in the account. No cash entries had been recorded. Amos had marked hundreds of dollars as settled without receiving money. Barrett searched 3 ledgers and found the same pattern. Paid, paid, paid. It looked less like bookkeeping than denial. By late afternoon, anger had replaced exhaustion. He stood behind the counter with one ledger open and another pressed flat beneath his hand. Amos had left him a store weakened by generosity, pride, or incompetence. Perhaps all 3. He had repaired half the town while letting his own roof leak and his own accounts decay. Barrett had spent years believing his father chose the store over him. Now it seemed Amos had not even chosen the store. He had chosen everyone. The bell above the door rang. Evie returned. She held the packet of screws from earlier, unopened. "These are right," she said. "The wood is wrong." Barrett stared at her. "What does that mean?" The rail pulled from the wall. "I think the plaster is giving way." He opened the ledger. Her name appeared twice. One entry listed lumber, brackets, and labor for a new handrail. The total was substantial. The amount received was less than 1/4. Beside the balance, Amos had written PID. Barrett turned the ledger toward her. "You didn't pay him." Evie's face changed, not with guilt, with dignity, preparing for injury. "I paid what I could." He marked the rest settled. "I know." "Why?" Evie looked toward the front window, where Rivet was trying to climb into the glove bin. "My daughter wanted me to move to assisted living after I fell." Barrett said nothing. Amos installed the rail, added a light above the back steps, and repaired the porch boards. He said, "A house should not become dangerous just because the person inside it got older. That doesn't explain why he didn't collect. I told him I would pay monthly, and he stopped accepting it." Barrett closed the ledger harder than necessary. That was not his decision to make. "No," Evie said. "It was his decision not to take it. He was running a business. He was also running out of time." The words quieted him. Evie's blue eyes did not soften. "He knew I wanted to die in my own house, Barrett. Not in a room where people called me by a number because names took too long." Her fingers tightened around the packet of screws. "Your father was very good at helping other people remain in their homes." She looked directly at him. "He just never learned how to make his own son want to remain in his." Rivet stopped moving. The puppy stood near the glove bin, watching Barrett with his head tilted. Something passed through Barrett that felt too sharp to be grief and too old to be anger. He wanted to answer Evie. Instead, he looked down at the ledger. When he raised his head, she had already turned toward the door. Tuesday morning arrived with pale sunlight and a cold wind off the water. At exactly 10 minutes past 9, Orrin Bell entered Wren & Son Hardware. Orrin was 76, tall and thin despite the slight bend in his back. His silver hair was combed carelessly beneath a faded cap, and a white mustache framed a mouth built equally for dry humor and stubborn silence. Fine sawdust clung to the shoulders of his red flannel shirt. A short carpenter's pencil rested behind one ear, and a small hearing aid showed beneath the hair on the other side. He carried a wooden toolbox worn smooth at the corners. Barrett had known him all his childhood. Orrin had once lifted him high enough to hang the first Christmas wreath above the store door. He had also attended Amos's funeral without speaking more than 12 words. Orrin placed 3 items on the counter: a packet of sandpaper, a box of brass nails, a peppermint bar. Barrett looked at them. You still buy the same things? Only on Tuesdays. Do you need them? Need is a dangerous standard. By that measure, half this town would own one chair and no dessert. Rivet emerged from beneath the counter. The puppy froze. His nose lifted. Then he ran directly to Orrin, caught the cuff of the old man's pants in his teeth, and pulled backward. Orrin went completely still. His weathered face lost color. He looked down at Rivet with an expression Barrett could not identify at first. Relief, pain, recognition. So, Orrin whispered. Amos managed too. He stopped. Barrett's attention sharpened. Managed to what? Orrin bent slowly and touched Rivet between the ears. It does not matter now. It matters to me. You have already decided to sell. That has nothing to do with the dog. Orrin straightened. It may have everything to do with him. Barrett's patience broke. You and my father spent 20 years speaking in unfinished sentences. Then he died, and now you stand here doing the same thing. Orrin's eyes hardened. You think silence belonged only to Amos. Barrett stared at him. You left, Barrett. I wrote. Christmas cards with no return address are not conversations. I called. 3 times in 19 years. The store seemed suddenly too small. Orrin's voice lowered. You and Amos were the same kind of proud. Both of you waited for the other man to become brave first. Barrett stepped back from the counter. Orrin collected his purchases. He left the wooden toolbox behind. Neither man noticed immediately. Rivet did. The puppy sniffed the box repeatedly, pressing his nose along one side panel. Then he began scratching at a narrow seam in the wood. Barrett redirected him once. Rivet returned. The side panel was already loose. Barrett worked it free with a flat screwdriver. Inside the hollow space lay a faded photograph. Amos, younger and broad-shouldered, stood beside Orrin in front of a house blackened by fire. Between them was Barrett's mother, her dark hair tied beneath a scarf, one hand resting on a stack of salvaged lumber. Barrett barely remembered the fire. On the back, in his mother's handwriting, were the words, The day we decid no, one in Briar, harbor should have to repair, a home alone. Laurel entered while Barrett was still holding the photograph. He showed it to her. Who was we? Laurel studied the image. Not only Amos and Orrin. Her finger rested near Barrett's mother. She started it. Before Barrett could ask what that meant, Rivet ran to the front door. The puppy stood with both paws against the glass, staring toward the road that curved behind the block toward Orrin's workshop. A low sound came from his throat. Not a bark, not fear, something closer to longing. Barrett looked from the puppy to the photograph in his hand. For the first time, the question was no longer whether Rivet had belonged to Amos. The question was how many parts of his father's life had continued without him. Barrett waited until late morning before returning Orrin Bell's toolbox. He told himself the delay had nothing to do with the photograph hidden inside it. The picture now rested in the top drawer beneath the register, face down beneath a stack of invoices. Barrett had already studied it more times than he intended. Each time, his attention returned to his mother's hand on the salvaged lumber and to the quiet certainty in her posture. She had looked like a woman beginning something, not mourning what had burned. Barrett did not know why that disturbed him. He placed Orrin's wooden toolbox in the bed of Amos' old truck, then opened the passenger door to move a bundle of canvas tarps. Rivet leaped in before Barrett finished. The 11-week-old German Shepherd landed awkwardly on the worn vinyl seat, scrambled upright, and planted both oversized front paws against the dashboard. His black and tan coat had begun to lose some of its baby softness along the spine, though his belly remained round and his right ear still folded sideways. He looked toward Barrett with the alert expectation of a small animal, convinced every open vehicle existed for his benefit. "You are staying here." Rivet sat down. Barrett reached for him. The puppy flattened himself against the seat and hooked one paw around the edge of the glove compartment. Barrett stared. Rivet stared back. There were men Barrett had once questioned in windowless rooms who had shown less determination. "You are not winning." 10 minutes later, Rivet rode beside him with a borrowed collar around his neck and a short leash secured to the door handle. Barrett drove away from Harbor Road. The truck smelled of old canvas, engine oil, coffee, and the faint tobacco scent Amos had carried even after quitting cigarettes 12 years earlier. Barrett had not noticed that smell during the first days after the funeral. Now it seemed to live in every seam of the vehicle. Rivet lifted his nose as though reading a story written in the air. At the first intersection, Barrett turned toward Maple Street. Rivet remained calm. At the next corner, Barrett continued straight. The puppy stood abruptly and placed both paws against the passenger window. Barrett glanced at him. "What?" Rivet gave a soft, impatient sound. Barrett slowed. The road to Oren's workshop turned right just ahead, though Barrett had not driven there since he was 17. He took the turn. Rivet settled again. The pattern repeated twice more. At each familiar junction, the puppy became alert before the truck changed direction. Barrett experimented once by continuing past a narrow lane bordered by stone walls. Rivet turned in the seat, looked behind them, and whined. Barrett reversed 20 feet and entered the lane. The puppy relaxed. There was nothing mystical about it. Dogs remembered routes through scent, sound, and repeated movement. Rivet had likely traveled this road several times in Amos's truck or Oren's van. Still, Barrett disliked how certain the puppy seemed. Certainty had always been more dangerous than mystery. Oren's workshop stood at the edge of a maple grove behind the older part of Briar Harbor. It was a long, weathered building with dark green siding, a metal roof, and broad windows clouded by years of sawdust. Stacks of lumber rested beneath a lean-to along one wall. Several hand-carved chairs stood beneath the porch roof like patient, old men waiting for conversation. No vehicle was parked near the front. A note had been pinned to the door. "At clinic. Back after noon. League check. Do not steal anything heavier than you can carry." Barrett recognized Oren's handwriting. He set the toolbox beside the door. Rivet pulled toward the side of the building. Easy. The puppy ignored him and followed a line of scent across the gravel. He moved with his nose low, pausing at a weathered gate before squeezing through a gap where one hinge had sagged. Behind the workshop stood a small covered run made from scrap lumber and wire fencing. Barrett stopped. Inside lay a stainless steel water bowl, a torn bag of puppy food folded shut with a carpenter's clamp, and a low sleeping platform lined with an old gray blanket. Rivet entered without hesitation. He sniffed the blanket, circled once, then placed his chin on it. Barrett crouched and lifted one corner. The wool carried a familiar scent, Amos's coat. Not the same coat from beneath the hardware counter, but another work jacket washed so many times that the canvas had gone soft at the elbows. Barrett's throat tightened. Near the shelter wall hung a narrow leather collar. The buckle had been polished, but the leather remained unfinished along one edge. A small brass tag rested beside it on the workbench, Rivet. The name had been engraved clearly. Below it, in smaller letters, someone had begun a second line. Barrett Duar. The work stopped before the surname was completed. Barrett stood very still. The puppy nosed his hand. He looked toward the open workshop window, the empty yard, and the collar waiting for a name that had never been finished. Amos had not merely known about the dog. He had chosen the name. He had placed Barrett's name beside it. The discovery should have felt tender. Instead, anger rose through Barrett with the clean speed of flame finding dry wood. His father had avoided direct conversation for 19 years. He had ignored birthdays, sent brief Christmas cards, and allowed entire seasons to pass without asking whether Barrett was alive, lonely, married, wounded, or afraid. Yet Amos had found time to buy leather, to engrave brass, to plan a gift. Barrett picked up the tag. "You thought this would do it." Rivet watched him. "A dog?" The puppy's folded ear twitched. "You thought you could hand me something warm and breathing, and that would make everything else disappear." The words sounded foolish, spoken aloud, but they had been waiting somewhere inside him. Barrett looked at the unfinished inscription. "Couldn't call. Couldn't say you were sorry. But you could put my name on a collar." A truck door closed near the lane. Laurel appeared around the corner, carrying a covered basket in both hands. She had changed out of her bakery apron and wore dark jeans, sturdy brown boots, and a rust-colored cardigan over a white blouse. Sunlight touched the copper tones in her chestnut hair, which hung loosely at her shoulders today. She was not delicate, though strangers sometimes mistook her calmness for softness. Years of running a business alone had given her a practical patience, the kind that could wait through another person's anger without becoming responsible for it. "I brought Orrin lunch," she said. Barrett held up the brass tag. Laurel stopped. Her eyes moved to the collar, the blanket, and Rivet resting in the small shelter. "So, Amos kept him. Here, he prepared him. For you?" Barrett laughed once without humor. "That is what the metal says." Laurel set the basket down. Barrett continued before she could answer. "He thought a puppy could repair 20 years. I doubt Amos thought anything could repair 20 years. Then what was this? Maybe an attempt." "At what?" Laurel looked at Rivet. "Keeping you in one place long enough to find out." Barrett's mouth tightened. "You make it sound noble. I did not say it was noble." Laurel stepped closer to the workbench. "Your father was generous with strangers because strangers were easy. They thanked him for fixing a porch and went home. You were harder. You could ask why he had failed you." Barrett looked away. Laurel's voice softened, but only slightly. Maybe Rivet was not an apology. Maybe he was the only first sentence Amos managed to finish. Barrett placed the tag back on the table. "How did he know when I was coming? I don't know. You knew he had the dog. No, you knew about the workshop. I knew he and Orrin spent time here. That is not the same thing." Barrett did not entirely believe her, but Laurel's expression held no evasion. His phone vibrated. 3 missed calls appeared on the screen, all from Micah Tolliver. The name had been following Barrett since the funeral. Micah was 42 years older in experience, despite being only 2 years older in age. He had served as a Navy corpsman attached to Barrett's unit, a compact, muscular man with warm brown skin, a shaved head, and deep-set dark eyes that missed very little. A pale scar crossed one side of his chin from a helicopter landing that had gone wrong in Afghanistan. Micah had once been quick with jokes and quicker with bandages. After leaving the service, he became quieter, though never distant. He was one of the few men who knew Barrett's silence was not strength. Barrett had ignored every call. He pressed the number now. Micah did not answer. A text arrived less than a minute later. "Amos knew you would return because I told him. I am sorry." Barrett read the message twice. Laurel watched his face. "What happened?" "My father spoke to a man I served with. About you, he knew when I would come back." Laurel said nothing. That restraint made Barrett angrier than sympathy would have. "He could call Micah," Barrett said. "He could ask about my schedule. He could plan a dog. But he could not call me." Rivet rose and came to stand against Barrett's boot. Barrett stepped away. The puppy followed. Stop. Rivet stopped. For one moment, the small dog looked less playful than usual. His dark eyes remained fixed on Barrett, not frightened, only uncertain why proximity had suddenly become unwelcome. Barrett felt a stab of shame and resented the puppy for causing it. A vehicle rattled into the yard. Orrin's faded green van appeared between the trees and stopped near the workshop. Orrin climbed out slowly, favoring his left leg. He wore a dark blue work shirt beneath his flannel jacket, and his face looked more tired than it had in the store. The clinic visit had left a white adhesive strip visible above one boot. He saw Barrett beside the dog run and did not appear surprised. "You found it," he said. Barrett held up the collar. "You knew, yes. How long?" "Several weeks." Orrin carried a paper envelope from the clinic and walked toward them with careful, stiff steps. Amos found Rivet near County Road 6. A delivery truck had nearly hit him. The driver stopped, but the puppy ran beneath Amos's truck and refused to come out. He brought him here. At first, the hardware store was too busy during the day, and Amos did not want half the town naming the dog before you arrived. He named him himself. He said a dog that collected metal ought to have an honest name. Barrett looked toward Rivet. The puppy had found a wood shaving and was chewing it with concentration. "How long did my father care for him?" "Just over 3 weeks. And after the stroke, I brought Rivet here. The night before you returned, he slipped through that gate. I searched until dark. You never told anyone." "I told the clinic. I told Laurel to watch the road." "I thought he had gone toward the woods." Orrin looked at the puppy. "Seems he went looking for Amos instead." Barrett's eyes narrowed. "He found the truck, most likely. Amos drove him between the store and the workshop. The truck still carried his scent. The explanation was practical. That made it more painful. Rivet had not been sent by fate. He had simply followed the strongest trace of the man who had cared for him and found Barrett standing at the end of it." Barrett asked, "Why didn't you tell me the first morning?" Orrin removed his cap and rubbed one hand across his silver hair. "Because Amos planned to explain it himself. He is dead, I noticed. Then you should have spoken." Orrin looked toward the workshop windows. "You think I do not know that?" His voice had changed. The dry humor disappeared, leaving only age and regret. "Amos died before he finished the collar, before he finished the project, before he finished half the things he should have said to you. I was left holding all of it. That was your choice. No, keeping quiet was my choice." Orrin met Barrett's gaze, and it was a poor one. The admission slowed Barrett's anger but did not end it. He walked to Amos's truck and returned carrying the iron box from beneath the hardware counter. Orrin's face tightened when he saw it. "Where is the key?" Barrett asked. Orrin did not answer. "You know what is inside." "Yes, then give me the key." "Not yet." Barrett took one step closer. "No one gets to decide that anymore. Not Amos, not you. You are right. Then stop acting as though I am not." Orrin looked at the packed boxes visible through the truck window. "Amos told me not to give you the key while you were still planning to open the box, sell the building, and leave before the words inside had any chance of meaning something." Barrett's grip tightened around the iron box. "So he is still controlling the conversation?" "No, he is asking you to have one. With a dead man? With yourself." Barrett placed the box in the truck harder than necessary. "I am selling the store." Orrin nodded slowly. "Then perhaps the box should stay closed." Barrett left without saying goodbye. That night, wind moved through Briar Harbor from the water, rattling the old sign above the hardware store. Barrett slept lightly in the stockroom. Shortly after 2 in the morning, the rear lock turned. A figure entered quietly, using a key. Rivet lifted his head from the folded blanket near Barrett's cot. The puppy sniffed the air. His tail moved once against the floor. He did not bark. The figure crossed the dark store, removed the iron box from beneath the counter, and left through the rear door. Barrett woke after sunrise. The space beneath the counter was empty. The lock showed no damage. Nothing else had been disturbed. Near the back entrance lay a faint streak of pale sawdust. Barrett did not need a detective. He drove to Orrin's workshop with Rivet beside him. Orrin stood at his workbench, shaping the edge of a pine board with a hand plane. Barrett entered without knocking. "You took it." Orrin stopped working. He did not deny it. "Amos left me a choice." Barrett stole it. "No." Orrin placed the plane down. "I stopped you from turning it into another item packed for sale. What is inside?" Orrin's lined face tightened with something that looked almost like grief. Then he looked at Rivet. "The thing your father feared you would understand too late." Margaret Sloane's office occupied the second floor above Briar Harbor's old pharmacy, where the stairwell smelled faintly of dust, wintergreen, and paper that had outlived the people who signed it. Barrett arrived just after 9 with a canvas folder beneath one arm and Rivet trotting beside him on a short leash. The puppy had recently discovered that stairs were less frightening when attacked at speed, so he climbed the first 6 steps in a burst, lost confidence halfway up, and looked back as if Barrett had designed the staircase badly. Margaret opened the door before he knocked. At 67, she was slim and straight-backed, with silver hair cut neatly at her jaw and sharp brown eyes behind narrow glasses. She wore a dark green blouse beneath a charcoal cardigan, and every object in her office appeared to have been placed after legal consultation. Her calm manner was not softness. Years of handling divorces, estates, disputed boundaries, and families who became strangers over furniture had taught her that truth rarely needed a raised voice. "No dogs on the furniture," she said. Rivet sat immediately. Margaret looked at Barrett. "He understands boundaries faster than most heirs." Barrett placed Amos's ledgers on her desk. "I need the exact situation." "You needed it 4 days ago." "I was occupied with grief or avoidance." "Inventory." Margaret removed her glasses and polished them once. "Your father also called avoidance inventory." Barrett did not respond. She opened a property map and turned it toward him. The Wren and Son hardware parcel occupied the corner of Alder Street and Harbor Road. Behind it lay a narrow service lane, then Orrin Bell's workshop and lumber yard. Northline had already acquired 2 neighboring storefronts and an empty warehouse near the waterfront. Margaret tapped the map. Amos owned the store building, the main lot, and the narrow loading area on the east side. Orrin owns his workshop, the rear strip, and the only practical route wide enough for delivery trucks to enter the proposed development. So Northline needs both. Very much. Can my sale force Orrin to sell? No. Then why are they offering this much? Because owning your parcel isolates his. Once construction begins around him, access becomes inconvenient, noise increases, taxes may rise, and pressure does the work a contract cannot. Barrett leaned back. So Nolan wants me first. Nolan wants certainty first. Margaret slid a summary sheet across the desk. The store is not bankrupt. That distinction matters. Barrett read the figures. The line of credit was larger than he expected, but not fatal. Roof repairs had been financed. Electrical upgrades had been paid partly in cash and partly through a local loan. Suppliers were current except for 2 invoices due at the end of the month. You have approximately 30 days to present the bank with a workable cash flow plan, Margaret said. After that, the lender may tighten terms or demand additional security, and if I sell, the debts are settled from the proceeds. You leave with a substantial remainder. Clean, financially. He looked up. Margaret held his gaze. Clean is not the same as painless. Rivet had found a wooden ruler beneath a chair and was trying to carry it sideways through the doorway. Margaret took the ruler from him without looking. Barrett opened Amos's ledgers to the marked accounts. Explain these. Margaret studied the pages. They are not all unpaid debts. No money entered the account, because not all payment was money. She pulled a smaller notebook from the folder. Amos had recorded exchanges in shorthand. 4 hours roof labor, 2 winter deliveries, snow removal, January through March, engine repair for Evie's neighbor, ride to oncology appointment, replace broken storm window at no charge. Barrett read in silence. Margaret said, "Your father operated an informal exchange network. Customers who could not pay immediately often repaid through work or by helping someone else. That is not accounting." "No, it is not enforceable. Usually not. It leaves the business carrying the cost." Sometimes, Barrett closed the notebook. He made everyone responsible for everyone else without asking whether they wanted the burden. Margaret's expression remained neutral. Or he gave people a way to pay without humiliating them. He still left the numbers to me. That part is true. The answer irritated Barrett because it did not excuse Amos or condemn him. Margaret had a talent for leaving responsibility where it belonged, even when several people had to share it. She pushed the property map closer. If you sell, Oren will face pressure. If you stay, you will need a real business plan, not your father's collection of favors and good intentions. I did not say I was staying. No. You say that often enough for both of us. Outside the office, Rivet dropped the ruler down the stairs. The clatter echoed through the building. Margaret listened. Your father would have charged him for that. He would have marked it paid. Margaret's mouth almost moved. Almost. Barrett left the office with less confusion and more weight. By noon, Nolan Prentice was waiting inside Wren & Son Hardware. He stood near the front window in a navy overcoat, studying the ceiling as though deciding whether the building had enough dignity to demolish. His ash-brown hair was combed back neatly, and his clean-shaven face held the patient expression of a man accustomed to allowing other people time to agree with him. "I revised the offer," Nolan said. Barrett set Margaret's folder behind the counter. "Why? Because the rear access complicates the project." "You mean, Oren, I mean geography." Nolan placed a new document on the counter. The number was higher. High enough to erase every debt, replace Barrett's aging truck, fund several years without contract work, and leave Briar Harbor behind as thoroughly as a man could leave a place that had shaped him. Nolan watched him read. "Your father died behind this counter with insufficient cash reserves and a roof loan," he said. "Loyalty did not protect him from arithmetic." Barrett's jaw tightened. Nolan continued evenly. "I am not saying the store meant nothing. I am saying meaning does not make utility bills disappear." Barrett looked beyond him at the aisles. He imagined himself at 68, shoulders bent, hands stiff, opening the same door each morning. He imagined watching the harbor change while pretending routine was purpose. He imagined waiting for people who had learned to live without him. Worst of all, he imagined calling loneliness duty. Rivet climbed onto Barrett's boot and sat there. Nolan glanced down. "You could take the dog. That was always the plan. Then perhaps the building has already given you the only thing you need from it." The sentence followed Barrett long after Nolan left. The store became busier that afternoon. Not crowded, but alive enough that Barrett could no longer pretend the open sign meant nothing. Evie returned, carrying one work glove and looking annoyed. "Your animal stole the other one." Rivet lay near the entrance with Evie's missing glove beneath his chest. Barrett pointed. "Give it back." Rivet rested his chin on it. Evie folded her arms. I admire commitment, but that is mine. Barrett traded the glove for a scrap of packing paper. Rivet accepted the exchange and immediately carried the paper beneath a chair. Walt arrived 10 minutes later and found a small box of screws rolling toward his shoes. Rivet had nudged it from beneath the counter. Walt picked it up. I was going to buy these. You were? No. But apparently, I have been assigned. Near the key-cutting station, an elderly fisherman named Conrad Pike fell asleep in a wooden waiting chair. Conrad was in his late 70s, broad-faced and sun-weathered, with a white beard stained faintly by pipe tobacco. Rivet placed the old tennis ball on the man's stomach. Conrad startled awake, caught the ball against his chest, and looked around. Who threw that? Walt pointed at Rivet. He is organizing recreation for seniors. For a few minutes, even Barrett laughed. The sound surprised him. It came out low and rusty, but it was real. Rivet turned immediately, tail beating the floor, as though Barrett's laughter had been the purpose of the entire day. That small reaction unsettled Barrett more than the jokes. The puppy did not need the store. He needed Barrett to remain inside it. The thought arrived too clearly. Barrett looked toward the front door, and Rivet followed his gaze. The puppy's body became still, as though he recognized the first movement in a familiar departure. Then Rivet crossed the floor, seized one of Barrett's bootlaces, and leaned backward. The room laughed again. Barrett did not. For one suspended moment, the pressure on his boot felt less like mischief and more like an accusation. How many times could a man call leaving freedom before it became fear? Evie returned to the counter after replacing her glove. You should start the home repair list again. What list? Handrails, steps, loose doors, small things that become large when your knees stop forgiving you. I am selling, so you keep saying. Walt leaned against a display of batteries. Amos used to check on people before winter, furnaces, porch lights, smoke detectors. He also failed to bill them properly. He billed some of us in labor, and some of you in nothing. Walt's humor faded. There was a woman on Mill Road last year, fake electric company called her, told her to buy gift cards or they would cut her heat. Evie shook her head. Amos stopped her before she sent the numbers. Barrett looked at Walt. How? She came here to buy a kerosene heater. Amos knew the utility never demanded gift cards. He called the real number, then drove her home. Laurel entered from the bakery carrying a tray of rolls. She had heard enough to understand the subject. The back room could host one Saturday session, she said. Home safety, heating checks, scam warnings. What to do if someone lives alone? No, Laurel set the tray down. You did not ask what it would cost. The building is being sold. Then use it once before it becomes something else. I am not turning the store into a community center because everyone feels guilty now that Amos is dead. Evie's expression tightened. Laurel did not retreat, not guilt, memory. There is a difference. Yes, guilt wants relief. Memory asks responsibility. Barrett looked around at them. They all wanted something from the store. A handrail list, a place to gather, a version of Amos that remained useful after death. None of them had to sleep in the back room beneath his debts. I have a meeting, Barrett said. He collected his coat and the folder for Nolan. Rivet followed him to the door. Barrett drove first to Oren's workshop. The afternoon sky had darkened, and wind moved through the maple branches with a restless, papery sound. The workshop door was locked. No answer came when Barrett knocked. Oren's van was parked behind a stack of lumber where Barrett could not see it from the front. Laurel had mentioned that Oren sometimes made deliveries or went to medical appointments without carrying his phone. There was no broken window, no open gate, no obvious sign of danger. Barrett tried the handle again. Nothing. He returned to the truck. Rivet refused to climb in. The puppy stood near the wooden toolbox Orrin had left at the store, and now Barrett had placed on the truck floor. Rivet scratched the lid, then turned toward the workshop and whined. Enough. Rivet scratched again. Barrett lifted him into the passenger seat. The puppy twisted around, staring through the rear window as they drove away. Orrin is not there. Rivet gave a low, unhappy sound. Barrett tightened his hands on the wheel. He had spent years learning not to confuse instinct with evidence. In military operations, fear could make ordinary shadows move. Hope could make silence sound like rescue. A dog whining at a building was not proof. He drove toward the bank office where Nolan and a lending representative waited to discuss the preliminary agreement. 3 miles outside town, something shifted inside Orrin's toolbox. A small gray object rolled onto the truck floor. Barrett glanced down at the next stop sign. It was a hearing aid case. He pulled over. Inside was Orrin's spare device, a small flesh-colored hearing aid seated in blue foam. A folded note beneath it listed battery dates in Orrin's handwriting. Barrett stared at it. Orrin always wore hearing protection over his hearing aid when operating machinery. He never moved heavy lumber alone without being able to hear cracks, shifting boards, or warning shouts. Amos had drilled that rule into both men after a shelving collapse years earlier. Barrett called the clinic. A receptionist answered. "No," she said after checking. "Mr. Bell does not have an appointment today." Barrett ended the call. Rivet stood with both paws on the dashboard, body pointed back toward Briar Harbor. Barrett turned the truck around. The meeting folder slid from the seat and spilled papers onto the floor. He did not stop to collect them. By the time he reached Orrin's workshop, rain had begun tapping against the windshield. Rivet jumped down before Barrett fully opened the door. The puppy ran to the side entrance and pressed his nose beneath the gap. Then he lowered one ear to the wood. Barrett knelt beside him. At first, there was only wind. Then a faint sound came from inside. 3 knocks. Silence. 2 knocks. Barrett stopped breathing. The signal belonged to another lifetime. Amos had taught it to him when he was a child working around stacked lumber and locked storage rooms. 3. Pause. 2. It meant trapped. It meant alive. It meant come now. Only 3 people had ever used it. 1 was dead. 1 was kneeling outside the door. The 3rd was somewhere inside the dark workshop. Barrett called 911 before he touched the door. Rain had begun as a faint tapping against the workshop roof, but the wind was already gathering strength in the maple grove. Branches twisted above the building, their young leaves flashing pale undersides as the first spring storm rolled in from the coast. Rivet stood at the side entrance with his black and tan body rigid and his nose pressed near the threshold. The 11-week-old German shepherd no longer looked like the mischievous puppy who hid screws beneath store mats. His oversized paws were planted wide. One ear stood sharply upright while the other folded at the tip, and every part of him seemed focused on the faint sounds beyond the wood. The emergency dispatcher answered. Barrett gave the address, described the signal from inside, and reported that an elderly man might be trapped in a workshop containing heavy lumber, electrical machinery, and a partially below-grade storage area. "Do not enter if the structure appears unstable," the dispatcher warned. "I understand. Volunteer fire is 6 minutes out." Barrett looked through the nearest window. The glass was filmed with sawdust, but he could make out the shadow of a shelving unit leaning across the main aisle. One fluorescent tube inside flickered weakly. Beyond it, the floor seemed lower than it should have been. The front door was locked. The main entrance could not be opened more than an inch before something heavy stopped it from within. Barrett moved around the building instead of forcing it. His years as a Navy SEAL had trained him to act under pressure, but they had also trained him to distrust the first solution offered by fear. Speed mattered. So did not becoming the second casualty. He located the exterior breaker box and shut down the workshop's electrical supply. The flickering light died. A deep mechanical hum faded inside. The storm darkened the afternoon. "Orrin," Barrett shouted through the wall. "I'm here." No answer came. Then, faintly, 2 uneven knocks. Alive. Rivet began pawing at a warped section of siding near the ground. One board had pulled away enough to leave a narrow opening where rot had weakened the lower frame. Before Barrett could catch him, Rivet flattened his body and slipped through. Rivet, the puppy, vanished into the darkness. For 3 seconds Barrett heard nothing, then Rivet barked twice from somewhere beyond the side wall. The sound was sharp and close. A moment later, the puppy squeezed back out, damp sawdust clinging to his muzzle. He turned immediately and ran several feet along the foundation toward the rear corner, where an old coal hatch opened above the lower storage level. He barked again. Barrett followed. The hatch was partly blocked by a stack of split firewood, but there was space beneath it where air moved from inside. Barrett knelt and called Orrin's name. A weak voice answered. About time. Relief hit Barrett so quickly it almost felt like anger. "Can you breathe? Enough to complain. Are you bleeding?" "My head. Legs trapped. Any neck or back pain?" "Everything hurts." That's specific enough. It was. Barrett heard a siren through the trees. A red rescue truck rounded the bend moments later, followed by a smaller utility vehicle. Briar Harbor's volunteer fire department arrived without ceremony, its tires throwing water across the gravel. The first man out was Chief Daniel Kincaid, 54, broad through the chest and thick in the forearms, with iron-gray hair cut close and a grizzled beard that had more white in it than Barrett remembered. Daniel had spent 28 years as a building contractor before becoming fire chief, and that experience had made him cautious around damaged structures. He was known for speaking slowly at fires and quickly at town meetings, where patience was less useful. He wore a yellow turnout coat open over a dark station shirt. "What do we have?" Barrett gave him the facts in order. Daniel listened without interrupting. "You shut the power?" "Yes." "Good." 2 more volunteers moved equipment from the truck. One was Lena Ortiz, a 36-year-old emergency medical technician with compact shoulders, warm brown skin, and black hair braided tightly against her head. Her face was calm and direct, shaped by years of arriving at people's worst moments and refusing to make those moments about herself. The other was Matthew Crane, a 29-year-old carpenter and volunteer firefighter, tall and lean, with sandy hair plastered to his forehead by rain. He carried cribbing blocks, a rescue saw, and a coil of heavy straps. Daniel inspected the front entrance, then the side window. "Main racks down," he said. "Floor may have failed under the load." "There's access from the rear hatch," Barrett said. "Too narrow for a stretcher." "Side door?" "Maybe, but we brace first." Rivet barked from beside the foundation. Daniel looked down. "That the dog who found him?" "He heard him." Daniel nodded once. "Keep him outside." Barrett clipped Rivet's leash to a fence post. The puppy pulled against it immediately, eyes fixed on the workshop. Barrett crouched. "You stay," Rivet whined. "I mean it." The puppy stopped pulling, but his body remained angled toward the building, as though obedience had not changed his opinion. Daniel approved entry through the side door, after Matthew placed temporary exterior bracing against the weakened wall. Barrett used a pry bar to force the lock while Daniel controlled the door from behind. The first 6 inches opened easily. Then the door struck fallen lumber. They widened the gap enough for Barrett and Daniel to move through sideways. The air inside smelled of wet wood, machine oil, and fresh split pine. Their helmet lights, cut across a workshop, transformed into a trap. A tall storage rack had collapsed diagonally across the center of the room. Boards, clamps, toolboxes, and unfinished furniture lay tangled beneath it. A section of floor near the lower storage pit had broken away, leaving jagged planks around a dark opening. Rainwater had already begun entering through a damaged roof seam. "Oren," Daniel called. "Here." The voice came from below the fallen rack. Barrett crawled forward over stable flooring, testing each board before shifting his weight. He found Oren partly in the collapsed lower section, pinned beneath the edge of a heavy cherry wood work table. One leg disappeared under the tabletop. Blood ran from a cut near his silver hairline, down the side of his weathered face, and into his white mustache. Despite the pain, the old carpenter's eyes remained alert. His hearing aid was missing. "Look at me," Barrett said. Oren did. "Any trouble breathing?" "No. Can you feel your foot?" "Some." Barrett touched the exposed ankle. "Tell me when." He pressed one point, then another. Oren answered correctly. Circulation was impaired but present. Daniel examined the collapsed rack above them. "We don't lift until we stabilize that load." Barrett nodded. There were limits here. The strength in his shoulders meant nothing if the structure shifted. Oren needed leverage, cribbing, controlled movement, and enough patience not to turn rescue into panic. Matthew brought in heavy straps and timber blocks. Lena remained near the side entrance, preparing oxygen, dressings, and a rigid extraction sled. Barrett looped one strap around the leaning rack, while Daniel located 2 load-bearing points that could take compression. They placed timber braces beneath the frame and tightened the strap to an anchor outside. Oren watched them work. "You're scratching the table," he said. Barrett looked at him. "It's cherry. If you live, I'll pay double." "That seems excessive." "Then stay conscious long enough to negotiate." Oren's mouth twitched. A small shape appeared beneath the broken edge of the siding. Rivet. The puppy had slipped his collar. He crawled across the debris through a gap too narrow for a person and reached Oren's shoulder. "Rivet?" Barrett said sharply. The puppy ignored him. He lowered himself beside Oren's chest and pressed his warm body against the old man's flannel shirt. Oren closed one hand over Rivet's back. The effect was immediate. His breathing slowed. "Leave him," Lena said from behind Barrett. "As long as he stays clear." Barrett did. Outside, thunder rolled across Briar Harbor. The workshop shook faintly under the sound. They began building a lifting system. Matthew brought in a bottle jack. Barrett positioned it beneath a reinforced edge of the work table, while Daniel placed cribbing blocks beside the trapped leg. The plan was simple in theory. Lift less than an inch, insert support, reassess, then repeat. Barrett steadied the jack. His eyes moved over the floor, checking cracks, water flow, and shifting loads. That was when he noticed a scale model lying on its side beneath a nearby drafting table. It showed Wren & Son hardware with an added structure behind it. Even in the dim light, Barrett could see details: a wide ramp, low workbenches, a classroom area with pegboards, a repair bay, a smaller training space separated by a half wall. On the plans beside it, rain had blurred some of the ink, but the title remained readable. Wren Workshop Initiative. Below it, proposed program director, Barrett Wren. The old anger returned, not because the idea was foolish, because it was thoughtful. Amos had imagined the height of the workbenches, the width of the ramp, the use of the back rooms. He had imagined Barrett standing there. Again, his father had created a future for him without asking. Barrett looked down at Orrin. You knew about this. Orrin's face tightened. Not now. He put my name on it. He hoped. He decided. No, you all keep saying that as though writing my name on a building is not a decision. Orrin's voice weakened, but he forced the words out. Amos did not keep the store because of the store. Then why? A sharp crack came from above. One of the bracing timbers shifted half an inch. Daniel grabbed Barrett's shoulder. Conversation later. A loose board slid from the rack and crashed onto the floor beside them. Rivet flinched but remained against Orrin. The room had just reminded them that grief could wait. Wait could not. They tightened the strap and added another brace. Rainwater flowed more quickly toward the collapsed section, carrying sawdust into the pit. If the storm continued, Orrin's lower body would be exposed to colder water, and the saturated floor could weaken further. Daniel radioed the crew outside. Rear route still blocked. A volunteer answered through static. Too much lumber. We're cutting from the southeast corner. Rivet lifted his head. He looked toward the back wall and barked once. Then again. He climbed over Orrin's shoulder, moved several feet along the broken floor, and barked toward a narrow gap beneath an interior partition. Matthew aimed his light there. Airspace. Daniel studied the angle. That wall backs onto the lumber shed. He radioed outside. Shift your cut 4 feet north. Follow the dog's position. Minutes later, the rescue saw started on the other side. The blade's vibration traveled through the wall. Barrett continued operating the bottle jack. 1/4 inch, Daniel said. Barrett pumped slowly. The table rose. Matthew slid in a cribbing block. Hold. They checked the rack, the floor, Orrin's leg, and every contact point. Again. Lift, block, reassess. Orrin's face turned pale. Lena crawled close enough to place an oxygen mask over his nose and mouth. Stay with me, she said. I had no plans to leave. That is good, because paperwork is worse when patients die. Orrin's eyes shifted toward Barrett. Your father would have liked her. Save your strength. He liked people who gave orders. Orrin, he was less fond of following them. Despite everything, Barrett almost smiled. The saw broke through the rear wall. Fresh air and rain entered with the rescue crew. They widened the opening and passed in a rigid sled. Daniel gave the order. One final lift. Barrett worked the jack. Matthew and another firefighter stabilized the table. Lena protected Orrin's head and shoulders. The pressure eased from his leg. They slid him onto the sled inch by inch. The moment his boot cleared the table, one of the old beams above groaned deeply. Move, Daniel said. They carried Orrin through the new rear opening. Barrett followed with Rivet under one arm. Behind them, part of the leaning rack collapsed into the space they had occupied less than a minute earlier. Outside, rain struck Barrett's face like cold gravel. Lena and the medical crew examined Orrin beneath a portable canopy. They wrapped his injured leg, dressed the cut on his head, and secured him for transport. Orrin remained conscious. His fingers closed around Barrett's wrist before the ambulance doors shut. The box, he said. Barrett bent closer. Where Amos taught you to fix the first thing you ever broke. The doors closed before Barrett could ask more. The ambulance drove away through the rain. After the fire crew completed a safety inspection, Daniel allowed Barrett to retrieve only essential items from the stable section of the workshop. Barrett knew the place Orrin meant. In the rear corner stood an old cooling bench, scarred by burns, knife marks, and spilled glue. When Barrett was 7, he had dropped a flashlight from the loft and cracked its casing. Amos had made him sit at that bench and repair it instead of replacing it. Barrett opened the lowest drawer. The iron box rested inside. Orrin had moved it there to protect it, not destroy it. The key hung from a small hook beneath the bench. Barrett unlocked the lid. There was no money, no hidden deed, no confession of wrongdoing. Inside lay several unsent letters bound with twine, an old brass key to Wren and Son Hardware, a cassette tape, and a photograph of Barrett at 6 years old, asleep beneath the counter with one cheek against Amos's folded work coat. Rain drummed on the damaged roof. Rivet sat against Barrett's leg. On a shelf above the bench stood an old cassette recorder. Barrett inserted the tape and pressed play. Static filled the room. Then Amos's voice emerged, rough and hesitant. "Barrett, if you are hearing this, I suppose I have run out of time to ruin one more conversation." A long silence followed. Barrett could hear his father breathing near the microphone. Rivet lowered himself across Barrett's boot. Amos continued, "There is something about the day you left Briar Harbor that I never." The tape clicked. It had reached the end of the first side. Barrett stared at the recorder. To hear the rest, he would have to turn it over himself. Barrett carried the cassette back to Wren and Son Hardware, beneath his jacket, as though rain might damage more than the tape. By the time he returned to Harbor Road, the storm had moved east toward the water. Broken clouds drifted above Briar Harbor, and late afternoon sunlight spilled through them in long, pale shafts. The pavement shone. Gutters carried leaves and sawdust toward the harbor. Across the street, Laurel's bakery windows glowed with the warm amber light of the ovens. Inside the hardware store, Barrett placed the cassette recorder on the counter. Then he avoided it. He tightened a loose hinge on the paint cabinet, even though the door already closed. He wiped dust from shelves that would be dusty again by morning. He counted boxes of roofing nails twice and discovered the same number both times, which felt unreasonable given the day he had lived through. Rivet followed him from aisle to aisle. The 11-week-old German shepherd still had dried sawdust caught in the soft black fur along his chest. His tan paws seemed too large for his body, and his right ear remained folded, while the left stood upright with determined alertness. He watched Barrett with dark, steady eyes, occasionally picking up a washer or screw and carrying it several feet before setting it down somewhere less useful. Barrett brushed the puppy beside the counter. Rivet tolerated 3 strokes, then caught the bristles in his teeth. "You are not helping." Rivet pulled backward. Barrett released the brush. The puppy trotted away with it, proud of the victory. Barrett replaced a bulb above the key cutting station. He reorganized a drawer of cotter pins. He repaired the latch on the storeroom window. The tape remained on the counter. Every task gave him another few minutes in which Amos was still only a dead man who had left unfinished words behind. Once Barrett turned the cassette over, his father would become something more dangerous. Human. The bell above the front door rang. Laurel entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee in a cardboard tray. She wore a dark green sweater, jeans, and brown boots, still damp from the storm. Her chestnut hair had been tied loosely at the nape of her neck, and the wind had pulled a few strands across her freckled face. Her hazel eyes went first to Barrett, then to the recorder. She did not ask whether he had listened. That was one of the reasons Barrett trusted her more than he intended. Laurel set the coffee down. "How is Orrin?" "Stable. Possible fracture, concussion. They are keeping him overnight." "And you?" "Not admitted." That was not the question. Barrett looked toward Rivet, who had begun dragging Amos's brush beneath the counter. Laurel waited. She had always been able to remain inside a silence longer than Barrett. He had once considered that stubbornness. Now he understood it required more courage than leaving. "I do not know what is on the rest of the tape," he said. "No, I know what I expect. That is usually the trouble. Barrett looked at her. Laurel placed one cup nearer him. You can keep being angry after you listen. I had not asked permission. You rarely do. She nodded toward the recorder. But at least be angry at the right thing. Barrett stood behind the counter for another full minute. Then he sat. Rivet emerged from the shadows carrying the brush, dropped it near Barrett's boot, and curled beneath the stool. Barrett turned the cassette over. He pressed play. For several seconds there was only static, a thin sea of sound filling the old store. Then Amos breathed near the microphone. His voice was rougher on this side of the tape, tired and uncertain. The day you left Briar Harbor, I watched your bus from the corner near the pharmacy. I did not come to the station because I knew I would say the wrong thing again. A pause followed. Barrett's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Amos continued. I told you that you were running away. The truth was, I was afraid you would die somewhere I could not reach. Your mother was gone. I had already lost the one person who knew how to make this house feel like something other than lumber and nails. The tape clicked softly. I thought if I made you angry, you might stay long enough to fight with me. That was the kind of foolishness grief taught me. Barrett closed his eyes. He remembered the morning he left. Amos standing in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, refusing to help carry the bag. Barrett had wanted his father to say he was proud. Amos had wanted his son to say he was afraid. Neither had chosen the first honest sentence. Amos's voice returned. When you joined, I told people you were stubborn. I told Orrin you would learn discipline. I told myself you would come back when you had proven whatever needed proving. Another pause. But years passed, and pride became easier to maintain than love. Barrett lowered his head. Laurel remained on the opposite side of the counter, hands wrapped around her untouched coffee. Amos spoke about the calls. He had dialed Barrett's number after hearing of deployments. He had called on birthdays, on the anniversary of Barrett's mother's death, and once after a winter storm damaged half the town. Each time he reached voicemail. Each time he hung up. I kept thinking a man should know how to begin a conversation with his own son, Amos said. Then I decided if I did not know the right words, silence was safer. His breath caught faintly on the recording. It was not safer. It was only quieter. Barrett looked at the black phone beside the register. For years, he had kept the same number. He had seen missed calls from Maine area codes and dismissed them as wrong numbers, sales calls, reminders from a past he did not owe. He had been waiting for an apology with his arms folded. Just like Amos, the tape continued. I did not keep the store to trap you here. I kept it because your mother believed anything that could still be repaired should not be thrown away. Static rose briefly. Then Amos's voice faded. Another recording began. The sound quality changed at once. The room in the tape was larger, livelier. Someone laughed near the microphone. A woman spoke. Barrett stopped breathing. He knew the voice before memory supplied a face. His mother. Eleanor Wren had died when Barrett was 14, but her voice remained exactly as he had forgotten it, warm, quick, and faintly amused, as though the world was often absurd, but still worth correcting. We lost the kitchen wall, half the roof, and Amos's favorite chair, she said on the recording. He claims the chair can be repaired. Orrin claims the chair should be tried for crimes against furniture. A man laughed in the background. Young Orrin. Then Eleanor continued. The storm took our house apart, but the town came before the smoke had cleared. Walt brought coffee. The Carters brought tarps. Evie's husband brought a generator. People who had no spare money brought hands. Her voice softened. That is what a town is. Not a place where everyone knows your name. A place where someone notices when your door does not open. Barrett stared toward the front entrance. The bell above it hung still. Eleanor described how the fire and ice storm had led her, Amos and Orrin, to start a small repair circle. They would fix handrails, broken steps, cracked windows, and unsafe heaters for older residents and families who could not afford full labor costs. Not charity, she insisted on the recording. People pay what they can: money, time, soup, snow shoveling, rides to the clinic. Nobody has to become helpless simply because life becomes expensive. Barrett understood then. The strange marks in Amos's ledgers were not random generosity. They were the remains of a promise his parents had made together. The store had not stolen Amos from his family. It had once been part of the family's idea of love. Amos's older voice returned near the end of the tape. Your mother made the store larger than a business. After she died, I kept the work and lost the reason. I helped strangers because strangers were easier. They did not know where I had failed. Barrett looked at Laurel. She did not look away. You do not owe me this store, Amos said. You do not owe me your life. I only wanted for once that when you left because you truly wanted to go. Not because you were still running from a man who had become too ashamed to ask you to stay. The tape continued into the final portion. Amos spoke about Rivet. He had found the puppy trembling beneath a parked truck after nearly being struck on County Road 6. Each time Amos moved him away, Rivet returned to the same tire, waiting for the vehicle's absent driver, as if loyalty could summon someone back. I thought he understood waiting for a person who did not know he was being waited for, Amos said. A faint laugh entered his voice. He steals screws, sleeps in the glove bin. Orrin says one ear may never stand, which I consider proof the dog has sense enough not to meet expectations. Rivet lifted his head at the sound of Amos's voice. The puppy looked toward the recorder. Barrett's chest tightened. I did not mean him to replace me, Amos said. A dog should not have to carry a dead man's apology. The next words came slowly. I only wanted the place you lived to have one heartbeat that refused to give up on you. The tape ended. The reels stopped turning. Barrett did not move. Outside, a truck passed through wet pavement. Somewhere across the street, the bakery bell rang. Ordinary sounds continued around a moment that had altered the shape of the room. Rivet rose. The puppy disappeared beneath the counter. A few seconds later, he emerged backward, dragging Amos's brown work coat by one sleeve. He pulled until the heavy canvas lay beside Barrett's feet. Then Rivet sat on it. Barrett stared down. He knew the behavior was not mystical. The coat smelled like Amos. It smelled like warmth, food, safety, and the man who had cared for Rivet during the first uncertain weeks of his life. But meaning did not become less real simply because it had a natural explanation. Barrett lowered himself to the floor behind the counter. Rivet climbed clumsily into his lap. Barrett placed one hand over the puppy's back. For a long time he said nothing. Then the words came. He called. Laurel remained still. Barrett looked at the dead telephone. I saw the numbers. I never answered. The confession did not excuse Amos. It did not erase 19 years. But it broke the clean story Barrett had told himself, the one in which only one man had failed. Rivet pressed his muzzle beneath Barrett's chin. Barrett closed his eyes. The next morning, he began gathering facts. He reviewed Orrin's plans for the Wren Workshop Initiative. He met Margaret and examined the actual financial requirements rather than the emotional promises. He visited Evie's house and saw the handrail Amos had installed. He found the back light, the reinforced steps, and a handwritten inspection date inside the electrical panel. June Carraway opened the archives of the Briar Harbor Weekly for him. June was 64, tall and narrow, with dark skin, silver-streaked black hair cut in a smooth bob, and amber-framed glasses that magnified a pair of patient brown eyes. She had edited the town's weekly newspaper for 27 years and possessed the calm persistence of someone who knew history was mostly composed of details powerful people assumed no one would save. She showed Barrett photographs of the old repair circle, articles about winter safety drives, and an interview with Eleanor Wren discussing older residents who wanted to remain in their homes. She was persuasive, June said. She usually was. Amos became quieter after she died. He was already quiet, not the same kind. June handed Barrett a folder containing a half-finished article Amos had never approved for publication. Its proposed title read, "Wren and Son Looks Forward." Barrett almost laughed at the optimism. Micah's messages included names of veterans interested in basic trade training. Laurel offered the bakery's back table for planning sessions. Walt produced a list of residents willing to help with deliveries. Evie gathered names of older homeowners needing small repairs. For the first time, Barrett saw the project not as Amos's demand, but as an unfinished possibility. He built a practical plan. The store would remain small. One day each week would be reserved for community repairs. A beginner workshop would teach tool safety to younger residents and veterans transitioning into civilian work. Volunteers would provide home safety checks for older residents. Laurel and June would help organize a session on fraudulent calls, heating safety, and emergency contacts for those living alone. The plan required 30 customer commitments, access to Oren's workshop, volunteer instructors, a community loan, and a 1-year trial. Barrett posted a sign-up sheet near the register. Evie signed first. Walt signed second, after complaining that the pen was inferior. Laurel signed third. Hours passed. No one else added a name. By late afternoon, 3 signatures sat on a page built for 30. Nolan entered carrying the Northline contract. He looked at the sheet. "Good intentions," he said. "Commitments. 3. It has been up 4 hours. Nolan placed the contract on the counter. Your father's wishes do not pay invoices." Barrett looked at the document. Nolan was right enough to be dangerous. The phone rang. Micah Tolliver's name appeared on the screen. Barrett answered. Micah's voice was deep, controlled, and familiar. "Amos sent me the workshop plans. I know. He sent something else." "What?" A question. Barrett waited. Micah said, "He asked whether you still knew how to let other people save you." The words entered more quietly than accusation and struck more deeply. Micah continued, "I'm coming to Briar Harbor. I am not bringing money. I am not promising the store survives." "Then what are you bringing?" "A few men who need a place to learn how to live normally again." Barrett looked at the 3 names on the page. Micah's voice softened. "The question is whether you are brave enough to open the door for them." Micah Tolliver arrived in Briar Harbor on a clear Saturday morning with 3 veterans and no promises. The sky above Harbor Road had been washed clean by the storm. Sunlight touched the wet roofs, the brick storefronts, and the old Wren and Son sign with such honesty that every crack in the paint seemed newly visible. Barrett stood outside the hardware store with Rivet at his boots. The 11-week-old German Shepherd had grown bolder in the past few days. His black and tan coat shone where the morning light struck it. His oversized paws seemed to find trouble before the rest of him arrived, and his right ear still folded sideways in stubborn refusal to match the left. He watched the approaching vehicle with a low, curious rumble in his chest. Micah stepped out first. At 40, he had the compact, powerful build of a man whose strength had been shaped by work rather than display. His warm brown skin showed faint lines around deep-set dark eyes, and his head was shaved close. A pale scar crossed the left side of his chin, a lasting mark from a helicopter landing that had gone wrong years earlier. He wore a dark canvas jacket, faded jeans, and boots polished more from habit than necessity. Micah looked at Barrett for a long moment. Neither man moved. Then Micah said, "You look older." Barrett answered, "You look shorter." Micah nodded once. "Good. We still know each other." The three men behind him climbed out more slowly. The first was Aaron Pike, 43, a former Navy electronics technician with a narrow face, sandy blonde hair beginning to thin at the temples, and wire-framed glasses that he adjusted whenever he felt uncertain. He had spent 15 years repairing communication systems aboard ships. Since leaving the service, he had failed 2 civilian job interviews because his hands shook whenever someone asked him to explain what he was good at. The second was Douglas Reed, 47, broad through the chest and heavier around the middle than his old uniform photographs suggested. His beard was dark with gray at the chin, and his right hand carried a thick scar across the palm from an accident during his final year of service. The injury had weakened 2 fingers, making fine mechanical work difficult. Douglas had once been known for repairing anything placed in front of him. Now he often refused to touch tools in public because he could not bear the moment someone noticed what his hand could no longer do. The youngest was Eli Mercer, 26, tall and lean, with close-cut black hair, fair skin, and a restless energy that made him shift his weight even while standing still. He had worked in military logistics, but had returned home unable to explain how tracking equipment, coordinating supply routes, and solving emergencies under pressure translated into a civilian resume. Rivet approached the group. He sniffed Aaron's boots, sneezed at Douglas's work glove, and sat directly on Eli's shoelaces. Eli looked down. "Is that a test?" Barrett said, "Everything is a test to him." Micah glanced through the store window. "You planning to let us inside?" Barrett unlocked the door. The bell rang overhead. For the next hour, Barrett showed them the building, the back room, the damaged inventory area, and the rough plans for the 1-year pilot program. He expected questions about money. Instead, Aaron asked whether the electrical bench could be lowered. Douglas wanted to know if hand tools with modified grips could be stored separately. Eli studied the shelves and suggested reorganizing community repair requests by urgency, material needs, and volunteer availability. Barrett looked at him. "That sounds like logistics." Eli's face changed. Only slightly, but enough. No civilian employer had said it that way before. Micah saw the moment and said nothing. That restraint was one of the reasons Barrett had survived serving beside him. They gathered in the back room around an old work table. Laurel brought coffee and a basket of warm biscuits from across the street. She wore a soft gray sweater beneath her bakery apron, and her chestnut hair was tied loosely at the back of her neck. Her hazel eyes moved over the group without pity, which made the room easier for everyone. Micah leaned against the wall. "These men do not need you to rescue them," he told Barrett. Aaron looked down at his coffee. Douglas flexed his injured hand once. Eli remained still for the first time that morning. Micah continued. "They need a place where usefulness is not measured by how well they pretend to be fine." Barrett looked through the open doorway toward the front counter. Rivet had climbed into the glove bin and disappeared, except for the tip of one tan paw. Micah's words settled inside Barrett with quiet force. For years, he had believed usefulness meant never needing anyone. Amos had believed something similar. Both men had made themselves reliable to strangers and unreachable to the people closest to them. The workshop plan had not been a command. It had been shelter disguised as work, and Amos had designed it for more than one wounded man. By noon, June Carraway had placed a notice in the Briar Harbor Weekly's front window. Wren and Son seeks 1 year. Commitment. The article did not describe Barrett as a hero. June refused that kind of easy language. She wrote instead about Amos and Eleanor's old repair circle, Orrin's workshop, the needs of older residents, and the proposed training days for veterans and young adults. Laurel placed a sign beside the bakery register. Walt Drummond told nearly everyone he met, though each version became slightly more dramatic. By the third telling, Rivet had apparently saved Orrin from beneath an entire collapsing forest. Barrett corrected him once. Walt replied, "Accuracy is important in newspapers. Conversation needs shape." The registrations came slowly. Sam Hollis, a 61-year-old electrician with thick gray eyebrows, a bald crown, and the careful hands of a man who respected both current and consequences, offered to teach 1 electrical safety session each month. Sam had lost a brother in a house fire caused by faulty wiring, and had spent the years since becoming almost severe about breaker boxes, overloaded outlets, and smoke detectors. Caroline Webb, 55, a vocational school instructor with short auburn hair, light brown skin, and a direct, energetic manner, offered to send 2 supervised students on repair days. She said young people needed to learn that skill and service could belong in the same sentence. Evie Mercer volunteered to maintain a list of older homeowners who needed small safety repairs. Walt agreed to call utility companies and public offices for anyone who received a suspicious demand for payment. Laurel promised breakfast for the first Saturday of every month. Orrin, still walking with a cane after the workshop accident, signed a temporary use agreement, allowing the program 1 day each week in his shop. His silver hair was combed back more carefully than usual, but sawdust still clung to his flannel shirt, as though refusing to accept his recovery leave. "I am not giving you the property," he told Barrett. "I did not ask. You were thinking loudly. I get that from Amos." Orrin studied him. "Yes," he said, "you do." Margaret Sloan created a small community fund with clear rules, written responsibilities, and no room for sentimental accounting. She required receipts. She required named supervisors. She required that no one use the phrase, "We will figure it out later," in any official meeting. Barrett asked whether that last rule was legally necessary. Margaret said, spiritually, the plan began to feel possible. Not certain, possible. That distinction mattered. Several townspeople still thought Barrett should sell. One fisherman said the store had already had its lifetime. A retired teacher warned that community enthusiasm faded when weather turned bad. A former customer told Barrett that staying for guilt would only create a second unhappy Wren behind the counter. Barrett listened. He did not dismiss them. They were not entirely wrong. 3 days before the North Line deadline, the sign-up list reached 24 commitments. Still short. The community loan had not been approved. Orrin's workshop needed repairs. The hardware store carried too much slow-moving inventory, and the eastern storage yard produced no income. Barrett stood alone after closing, studying the numbers. Rivet slept beneath the counter, with his nose resting on Amos's coat. Barrett thought of the contract. Selling would still be easier. Then he heard paper dragging across the floor. Rivet emerged with the sign-up sheet caught gently between his teeth. The puppy carried it to the door and dropped it beside the threshold. Barrett stared at the 24 names. The act was ordinary. Rivet liked paper. He liked carrying objects. He liked the door because interesting things happened there. But Barrett could not stop looking at where the page had landed, not behind the counter, not beneath Amos's coat, at the entrance, a list of people waiting to be allowed inside. The next morning, Barrett called Nolan. They met with Margaret in her office. Nolan arrived with a revised proposal and no pretense that the situation had become generous. Northline would purchase the eastern storage yard, a narrow section of land the hardware store no longer needed. The development company would redesign the commercial entrance and leave Oren's workshop untouched. Wren & Son's historic facade would remain. In exchange for local promotional rights and recognition in the project's public materials, Northline would fund part of the electrical upgrade required for the community workshop. Barrett read every page. What do you gain? Nolan folded his hands. A workable entrance, public support, and fewer people attending planning meetings solely to describe me as a vulture. You are not saving the store. No. Nolan's pale gray eyes remained steady. I realized destroying it would make my entire project something this town hated before the first tenant arrived. Barrett appreciated the honesty more than false kindness. The agreement had costs. The store lost part of its storage land. Barrett would have to reduce inventory. The workshop could operate only 1 day a week at first. The electrical funding covered only part of the renovation. Northline kept its larger development. No one won completely. That made the deal believable. Barrett signed. Then Margaret placed a second document before him. It was a 1-year operating commitment. No lifetime oath. No promise to become Amos. 12 months. Barrett held the pen. He remembered the day he left Briar Harbor, young and furious, convinced that departure itself proved courage. This signature asked for another kind. He signed his name. The reopening took place 6 weeks later. The old Wren & Son hardware sign remained above the door. The paint had been stabilized but not replaced. The blue border still showed its age. The words were still imperfect. Barrett had considered removing & Son. In the end, he left it, not because Amos had earned permanent authority over him, not because Barrett owed the dead obedience. He kept it because the name no longer felt like a chain. It felt like a door. Inside, the store carried a new rhythm. Oren sat at a low workbench, showing Douglas how to guide a chisel, using a modified grip that did not require full pressure from his injured fingers. Aaron repaired an old drill beside Micah, pausing once when his hands began to shake. Micah did not take over. He simply steadied the parts tray until Aaron continued. Eli organized repair requests on a wall chart divided by urgency, volunteer skills, and material cost. For the first time since returning home, his military experience had a civilian name. Evie tested a sample handrail near the rear wall. Walt distributed printed scam warning sheets while telling everyone he had personally defeated 3 fraudulent callers that month. Laurel placed bread and coffee beside the register. Rivet ran through the center aisle carrying a brown work glove. A customer looked down at his bare hand. That dog stole my glove. Barrett took a slow sip of coffee. He calls it quality control. Laughter moved through the store. Not loud enough to erase loss, only warm enough to live beside it. That evening, after the last volunteer left, Laurel helped Barrett lock the windows. He found himself tightening a screw on the front door hinge. Laurel watched him. "What are you doing?" "It is loose. It was loose yesterday." "I have been busy." She folded her arms. "Do not fix the hinge." Barrett looked at her. "Answer the question." "You did not ask one." Laurel's expression softened. "Are you staying because you want to? Or because you are afraid leaving would make you like your father?" The old Barrett would have looked down, found another task, or turned the question into irritation. His hand remained on the screwdriver. Then he set it down. "For 1 year," he said. That was not the question. He looked toward the store, the workbenches, the remaining boxes, and the worn counter. Then he looked at her. I want to see what happens if I do not leave first." Laurel nodded. No grand declaration followed. She only touched his arm once before walking across the street to the bakery. That was enough. Barrett turned off the lights one by one. The plumbing aisle darkened, then paint, then tools. He left the small amber lamp above the counter burning. Rivet disappeared beneath it and returned, dragging Amos's old brown work coat from the shadowed space below. For a moment, Barrett expected the puppy to crawl into the familiar darkness. Instead, Rivet pulled the coat into the open and circled twice upon it directly in front of the counter, where the warm light reached him. He lowered his head. One ear remained standing, the other folded gently sideways. Barrett placed his hand on the worn wood of the counter. "I am not staying because you held me here," he said quietly. The empty store gave no answer. "I am staying because you finally left me the choice." Rivet opened one dark eye. His tail touched the floor, once, then again, a small, steady rhythm. Amos Wren would never again stand behind the counter to greet his son. He would never hear Barrett say the words in time. But he had left behind one small heartbeat, a heartbeat that hid screws beneath rugs, stole gloves from paying customers, refused to let a lonely man reach the door too quickly, and reminded him that destiny did not always arrive like thunder over the sea. Sometimes it slept in an old work coat beneath a father's counter, waiting for a son to become brave enough to come home. Sometimes the miracle we pray for does not arrive with thunder, flashing light, or a voice from heaven. Sometimes God sends it quietly. It may come through an old door that refuses to close, a forgotten message waiting to be heard, a neighbor who remembers our pain, or a small puppy sleeping inside the coat of someone we thought we had lost forever. Barrett spent years believing that leaving made him strong. Amos spent years believing that silence could protect them both. But love cannot live forever in unfinished sentences. Healing began only when Barrett stopped running long enough to listen, and when he accepted that forgiveness does not erase the past. It simply prevents the past from deciding every day that follows. Rivet could not bring Amos back. He could not undo the missed calls, the angry words, or the years father and son had lost. But that little dog became proof that God can use even the smallest heartbeat to reopen a door that grief has kept locked. Perhaps there is someone in your own life you have not called because too much time has passed. Perhaps there is an apology you are waiting to receive, or one you are afraid to give. Perhaps you have convinced yourself that a broken relationship, an abandoned dream, or a tired heart is too damaged to repair. This story reminds us that not everything broken must be thrown away. Sometimes the first step is not a grand gesture. It is answering the phone, sitting through a difficult conversation, checking on an elderly neighbor, helping someone repair a loose step, opening the door to a person who needs a place to feel useful again. We may not always recognize God's plan while we are living through it. What feels like an interruption may be an invitation. What looks like a burden may become a blessing. And what appears to be a lost animal standing at our door may be the gentle answer to a prayer we were too wounded to speak. If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments about a person, an animal, or a small act of kindness that helped you find your way home again. Share this story with someone who may need to hear that it is not too late to return, forgive, rebuild, or begin again. Please subscribe to the channel for more stories of loyalty, healing, faith, and second chances. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, comfort every lonely heart, strengthen those carrying silent burdens, and place faithful companions beside you when the road becomes difficult. And may God give you the courage to keep one door open, because sometimes the miracle meant for us is already standing on the other side.